Hi everyone, this presentation covers Chapter 17, Ethical Consideration, in Jacobsen's Introduction to Health Research Methods, a Practical Guide, the third edition of this textbook. In this chapter, you will learn that researchers have an ethical obligation to minimize the risks that research may pose to participants. Here's an outline of the chapter. Section 17.1 covers Foundations of Research Ethics. Section 17.2 covers Respect, Beneficence, and Justice. Section 17.3 covers Incentives and Coercion. Section 17.4 covers Informed Consent Statements. Section 17.5 covers the Informed Consent Process. 17.6 covers Informed Consent Documentation. Section 17.7 covers confidentiality and privacy. Section 17.8 covers sensitive issues. Section 17.9 covers cultural considerations. And finally, Section 17.10 covers vulnerable populations. Section 17.1 includes the foundations of research ethics. It includes some key sets of principles that have come up over the past several decades, really to enhance the importance of ethics in human research. So the first one is the Nuremberg Code in 1947, and this mandated voluntary consent for experimental studies of humans. The second is the Declaration of Helsinki in 1964. This was written by the World Medical Association to provide guidelines for physicians conducting clinical trials. Then in 1979, the Belmont Report was published. This is the foundational document for the current U.S. federal policy for protecting human subject participants, and this is also called the Common Rule. Section 17.2 covers Respect, Beneficence, and Justice. Some key concepts for conducting human subjects research really starts off with the respect for persons. This emphasizes that autonomy, informed consent, voluntariness, and protection of vulnerable individuals are all considered when conducting any sort of research project. Autonomy is when an individual or his or her legal guardian is authorized to decide whether to volunteer to participate in a research study. And beneficence is that the study should do good by maximizing possible benefits and minimizing possible harms. So these must be in place in order for research to take place. You also need non-maleficence, meaning that the study should not do any harm, or that the researchers do not know of any harms that will be caused by doing the study up front. And distributive justice, and this requires that benefits and burdens of research are fairly allocated throughout the research process. So figure 17.1 covers 8 central considerations in research ethics, and these are called the 8 C's. And so it goes through these different categories and examples of questions to ask in order to ensure that you're meeting those categories. These categories include contribution, compensation, consent, confidentiality, community, conflict of interest, collaborators, and committees. And so you can go through the different questions that you want to ask yourself in preparation for your study to ensure that the study is meeting these ethical guidelines. Then figure 17.2 covers some sample ethical considerations for individual and community-based research projects. And this really goes through sample questions of how you can make sure that you are meeting those definitions for respect, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice. So section 17.3 goes over incentives and coercion. Anytime a research project is done, it should not be as if the participants are being coerced. So some studies do provide incentives for participation while others do not. This could be in the form of direct compensation or money. It could be an incentive of food. It could be a gas card. It could be some sort of gift card. But not all studies have them, but many do. Now, the desire to reward or thank participants must be balanced with the need for participation in any research project. And it must still be that it is considered voluntary. So every study must have the concept of voluntariness. So an individual must be able to make that decision about being in the study by their own free will without undue outside influence. And it should not be as if they're being coerced. Coercion is defined in this chapter as compelling individuals to participate in a research study that is in violation of the principles of autonomy and respect for persons. So researchers really have to be transparent about what participants will gain from participation in a research study and what they will not gain. And any incentives that are ever given should not be so much that it's as if the participant is being coerced in the study. This is very important for research studies that are done where students are participants in the study, because it could seem that if there's a very high incentive, that they may feel that they need that money, and so that they are being coerced in some form or fashion. So figure 17.3 goes over content for the informed consent statement. So anytime you have a research project, you have to go over some sort of informed consent process when you're collecting new data. Now this may be in paper, this may be verbally, there are different types, but it should all include information about the following somewhere within the document. And so these contact areas include what the research is, the purpose, participants that are included, the procedures, the benefits, the risks, confidentiality concerns and how to avoid them, that the study is voluntary and that they may quit at any time without any penalty, contact details for at least one researcher on the study, and a place where they can sign. And so 17.4 goes over more specifics about those informed consent statements. Informed consent is an individual's voluntary decision to participate in a research study after reviewing the essential information about the project. So they should know that information before deciding whether to be in the study. Informed consent statements must provide information about the project to the participants so they can make a thoughtful decision about enrollment. These statements should be clear, use simple language that the reader understands. So it should be a much lower reading level than, say, college level or above. It sometimes states that it's maybe like a 5th grade reading level for participants so that anybody can read it. Informed consent is a process and not just an act of giving someone a piece of paper and saying, please sign and give it back to me. There should be a line of communication between researchers and participants, and this should remain open throughout the data collection process. So people should be able to contact the research team if there are questions. Researchers must ensure the participants understand the research process and the consent document. And so understood consent really requires evidence that the potential participant comprehends the study benefits, risks, and procedures and knows their rights before agreeing to participate. And so within the informed consent documentation, there is an expectation that they will sign it. This would be if it's a paper documentation, and really depending on the goals of the study determines whether or not they need to have a paper document or not. But when the source population has a low literacy rate, it could be that signatures are not the best way to obtain consent. So it could be that you're able to use a thumbprint method or some other mark, or what I think is more commonly used is the verbal consent, or sometimes called oral consent. And verbal consent is when a spoken and witnessed consent is obtained rather than requiring a participant's signature. And this is often used with phone interviews. Section 17.7 goes over confidentiality and privacy. These are two different concepts that mean similar things but sometimes get confused. So privacy is the assurance that individuals get to choose what information they review about themselves. And then confidentiality is the protection of personal information that is revealed to the providers, that is revealed to the researchers. 17.8 covers sensitive issues. So researchers may ask questions about sensitive issues, and then they must decide ahead of time on how to handle disclosures. So let's say you ask participants about participation in illegal activities. So let's say you asked them something about marijuana use if it's in a state where it's not legal. So you must include information about what you're going to do with that. And you can apply for something called a certificate of confidentiality. And this protects the identity of participants in a study of sensitive topics. And so this ensures that they would not be subject to any sort of court order or legal demands by obtaining that information. Section 17.9 covers cultural considerations. A couple of definitions of these concepts that Jacobsen provides in this chapter include: culture is listed as ways of living, believing, behaving, communicating, and understanding the world that is shared by members of a social unit, whereas cultural competency is the ability to communicate effectively with people from different cultures and backgrounds. So when conducting a research study, the research protocol must be appropriate to the culture or cultures of the expected study participants. And so something that must also be considered is if you are using a different language. So if you are conducting your study with participants that speak Spanish as their first language versus English, you need to make sure that that is, number one, translated, but then also it is reviewed by someone that speaks that language. It also may be helpful to have someone from, say, a local advisory board facilitate communication between the community and a research team. And this is really important and used a lot in community-based participatory research methods. Section 17.10 covers vulnerable populations, and special procedures must be followed for vulnerable populations. So children and some adults, say adults with cognitive impairments, may be considered a vulnerable population because they're not competent to make an informed decision. So when this happens, there may be a legal representative that can provide consent for them, but it's also important to have their assent. An assent is an expressed willingness to participate in a study by a child or another person who is deemed not legally competent to provide his or her own consent. You do not want a parent to say that a student or a child can be in a study without this child wanting to actually be in the study. And so that's where assent comes in. The child should provide their own assent to say, yes, I want to participate. And so finally, all of these things are so important, and it's important for researchers to continue to know that changes in the guidelines and make sure that everyone is trained and certified. So Section 1711 covers ethics training and certification. So research ethics committees always require that everyone who is in direct contact with research participants and or their data complete some sort of formal research ethics training. And this is required through the IRB process, the institutional review board process that will be discussed more in other chapters. Okay, so that is it on chapter 17. Thank you for listening.